What? He shrieked. I see everything. All of the billions of lives that preceded me on this planet are before me at this moment. I see men of all ages, all races, all colors. They are fighting, killing, building, dancing, singing. They are sitting about rude fires on lonely gray deserts and flying through the air in monoplanes. They are riding the seas in bark canoes and enormous steamships. They are planting bison and mammoths on the walls of dismal caves and covering huge canvases with queer futuristic designs. I watch the migrations from Atlantis. I watch the migrations from Lemuria. I see the elder races, a strange horde of black dwarfs overwhelming Asia, and the Neanderthalers with lowered heads and bent knees ranging obscenely across Europe. I watch the Achaeans streaming into Greek islands and the crude beginnings of Hellenic culture. I am in Athens, and Pericles is young. I am standing on the soil of Italy. I assist in the rape of the Sabines. I march with the imperial legions. I tremble with awe and wonder as the enormous standards go by and the ground shakes with the tread of the victorious Hastate. 1,000 naked slaves grovel before me as I pass in a litter of gold and ivory drawn by night-black oxen from Thebes, and the flower girls scream, Ave Khazar, as I nod and smile. I am myself a slave on a Moorish galley. I watch the erection of a great cathedral. Stone by stone it rises, and through months and years I stand and watch each stone as it falls into place. I am burned on a cross, head downward, in the thyme-scented gardens of Nero, and I watch with amusement and scorn the tortures at work in the chambers of the Inquisition. I walk in the holiest sanctuaries. I enter the temples of Venus. I kneel in adoration before the Magna Mater, and I throw coins on the bare knees of the sacred courtesans who sit with veiled faces in the groves of Babylon. I creep into an Elizabethan theater with a stinking rabble about me, and I applaud the Merchant of Venice. I walk with Dante through the narrow streets of Florence. I meet the young Beatrice, and the hem of her garment brushes my sandals as I stare enraptured. I am a priest of Isis, and my magic astounds the nations. Simon Magus kneels before me, imploring my assistance, and Pharaoh trembles when I approach. In India, I talk with the masters and run screaming from their presence, for their revelations are as salt on the wounds that bleed. I perceive everything simultaneously. I perceive everything from all sides. I am a part of the teeming billions about me. I exist in all men, and all men exist in me. I perceive the whole of human history in a single instant, the past and the present. By simply straining, I can see farther and farther back. Now I am going back through strange curves and angles. Angles and curves multiply about me. I perceive great segments of time through curves. There is curved time and angular time. The beings that exist in angular time cannot enter curved time. This is very strange. I'm going back and back. Man has disappeared from the earth. Gigantic reptiles crouch beneath enormous palms and swim through the lowly black waters of dismal lakes. Now the reptiles have disappeared. No animals remain on the land, but beneath the waters plainly visible to me, dark forms move slowly over the rotting vegetation. These forms are becoming simpler and simpler. Now they are single cells. All about me there are angles, strange angles that have no counterparts on earth. I am desperately afraid. There's an abyss of being which man has never fathomed. I stared. Chalmers had risen to his feet and was gesticulating helplessly with his arms. I'm passing through unearthly angles. I'm approaching. Oh, the burning horror of it. Chalmers, I cried. Do you wish me to interfere? He brought his right hand quickly before his face, as though to shut out a vision unspeakable. Not yet, he cried. I will go on. I will see what lies beyond. A cold sweat streamed from his forehead, and his shoulders jerked spasmodically. Beyond life there are. His face grew ashen with terror. Things I cannot distinguish. They move slowly through angles. They have no bodies. They move slowly through outrageous angles. It was then that I became aware of the odor in the room. It was a pungent, indescribable odor, so nauseous that I could scarcely endure it. I stepped quickly to the window and threw it open. When I returned to Chalmers, looked into his eyes, I nearly fainted. "I think they have scented me," he shrieked. "They are slowly turning toward me." He was trembling horribly. For a moment he clawed at the air with his hands. Then his legs gave way beneath him and fell forward on his face, slobbering and moaning. I watched him in silence as he dragged himself across the floor. He was no longer a man. His teeth were barred and saliva dripped from the corners of his mouth. "Chalmers," I cried. "Chalmers, stop it, do you hear?" As if in reply to my appeal, he commenced to utter hoarse, convulsive sounds, which resembled nothing so much as the barking of a dog, and began a sort of hideous writhing in a circle about the room. I bent and seized him by the shoulders violently. Desperately I shook him. He turned his head and snapped at my wrist. I was sick with horror, but I dared not release him for fear that he would destroy himself in paroxysm of rage. "Chalmers," I muttered, "you must stop that. There is nothing in this room that can harm you. Do you understand?" I continued to shake and admonish him, and gradually this madness died out of his face. Shivering convulsively, he crumpled into a grotesque heap on the Chinese rug. I carried him to the sofa and deposited him on it. His features were twisted in pain. I knew he was still struggling dumbly to escape from abominable memories. "Whiskey," he muttered. "You'll find a flask in the cabinet by the window. Upper left-hand drawer." So, sort of like that Altered State movie in 1982. I think that's when that movie came out. I was, or maybe it was before I was born, I don't know. But, sort of the arrogance of meth and sort of like that, all into one. But through our psychology, we respond to everything, so, and doing other drugs isn't going to fix things. "Whiskey," he muttered. "You'll find a flask in the cabinet by the window, upper left-hand drawer." When I handed him the flask, his fingers tightened about it until the knuckles showed blue. "They nearly got me," he gasped. He drained the stimulant the depressant, in immoderate gulps, and gradually the color crept back into his face. That drug was the very devil. "It wasn't the drug," he moaned. His eyes no longer glared insanely, but he still wore the look of a lost soul. "They scented me in time," he moaned. "I went too far." "What were they like?" I said, to humor him. He leaned forward and gripped my arm. He was shivering horribly. "No words in our language can describe them." Well, gin, obviously. He spoke in a hoarse whisper. "They are symbolized vaguely in the myth of the fall, and an obscene form which is occasionally found engraved in ancient tablets. The Greeks had a name for them, which veiled their essential foulness. The tree, the snake, and the apple, these are the vague symbols of a most awful mystery." His voice had risen to a scream. "Frank! Frank! A terrible and unspeakable deed was done in the beginning, before time, the deed, and from the deed." He had arisen and was hysterically pacing the room. "The deeds of the dead move through angles in the dim recesses of time. They are hungry and athirst." "Chalmers," I pleaded to quiet him. "We are living in the third decade of the 20th century. They are lean and athirst," he shrieked. "The Hounds of Tindalos." "Chalmers, shall I phone for a physician? A physician cannot help me now. They are horrors of the soul, and yet," he hid his face and in his hands and groaned, "they are real, Frank. I saw them for a ghastly moment. For a moment I stood on the other side. I stood on the pale gray shores, beyond time and space, in an awful light that was not light, and a silence that shrieked. I saw them. All the evil in the universe was contracted in their lean, hungry bodies. Or had they bodies? I saw them only for a moment. I cannot be certain, but I heard them breathe. Indescribably, for a moment, I felt their breath upon my face. They turned towards me, and I fled, screaming. In a single moment, I fled screaming through time. I fled down quintillions of years, but they scented me. Men awake in them, cosmic hungers. We have escaped momentarily from the foulness that rings them about. They thirst for that in us, which is clean, which emerged from the deed without stain. There is a part of us which did not partake in the deed, and they that hate, but do not imagine that they are literally, prosaically evil. They are beyond good and evil as we know it. They are that which in the beginning fell away from cleanliness. Through the deed they became bodies of death, receptacles in all foulness. But they are not evil in our sense, because in the spheres through which they move there is no thought, no moral, no right or wrong as we understand it. There is merely the pure and foul. The foul expresses itself through angles, the pure through curves. Man, the pure part of him, is descended from a curve. Do not laugh. I mean that literally. I rose and searched for my hat. I am dreadfully sorry for you. Calmers. I said as I walked towards the door, but I do not intend to stay and listen to such gibberish. I'll send my physician to see you. He's an elderly, kindly chap. He won't be offended if you tell him to go to the devil. But I hope you'll respect his advice. A week's rest in a good sanitarium should benefit you immeasurably. I heard him laughing as I descended the stairs, but his laughter was so utterly mirthless that it moved me to tears. Now, in America, we have the right. Spiritual consciousness is not something the psychologists can even, we have the right to not be labeled as mentally ill because of our spiritual awareness. Now, people hurting themselves, that's a whole different matter. People high on drugs, maybe we shouldn't consider the, drug use disorder, as these things are sometimes called. Perhaps that would be better diagnosis in those cases, rather than straight up schizophrenia. But sorcery, one of the aspects of sorcery is often drug use, and that could open the awareness, but it could just cause weakness too. When Calmers, the weakness could outweigh the awareness. When Calmers phoned me the following morning, my first impulse was to hang up the receiver immediately. His request was so unusual, and his voice was so wildly hysterical, that I feared any further association with him would result in the impairment of my own sanity. But I could not doubt the genuineness of his misery, and when he broke down completely, and I heard him sobbing over the wire, I decided to comply with his request. Very well, I said. I will come over immediately and bring the plaster. En route to Calmer's home, I stopped at a hardware store and purchased 20 pounds of plaster of Paris. When I entered my friend's room, he was crouching by the window, watching the opposite wall out of eyes that were feverish with fright. When he saw me, he rose and seized the parcel containing the plaster. With an avidity that amazed and horrified me, he had extruded all the furniture, and the room presented a desolate appearance. It is just conceivable that we can thwart them, he exclaimed, but we must work rapidly. Frank, there is a step-ladder in the hall. Bring it here immediately, and then fetch a pail of water. What for? I murmured. He turned sharply, and there was a flush on his face. To mix the plaster, you fool, he cried, to mix the plaster that will save our bodies and souls from a contamination unmentionable, to keep out the plaster that will save the world from... Frank, they must be kept out. Who? I murmured. The Hounds of Tindalos, he muttered. They can only reach us through angles. We must eliminate all angles from this room. I shall plaster up all the corners, all of the crevices. We must make this room resemble the interior of a sphere. I knew that it would have been useless to argue with him. I fetched the stepladder. Calmers mixed the plaster, and for 3 hours we labored. We filled in the four corners of the wall and the intersections of the floor and the wall and the ceiling, and we rounded the sharp angles of the window seat. Now, one of the things that we see in a lot of old temples is the rounding of the corners. I shall remain in this room until they return in time, he affirmed. When our task was completed, when they discovered that the scent leads through curves, they will return. They will return ravenous and snarling and unsatisfied to the foulness that was in the beginning, before time, beyond space. He nodded graciously and lit a cigarette. It was good of you to help, he said. Will you not see a physician, Calmers? I pleaded. Perhaps tomorrow, he murmured. But now I must watch and wait. Wait for what? I urged. Calmers smiled wanly. I know that you think me insane, he said. You have a shrewd but prosaic mind. You could not conceive of an entity that does not depend for its existence on force and matter. But did it ever occur to you, my friend, that force and matter are merely the barriers to perception imposed by time and space? When one knows, as I do, that time and space are identical, and that they are both deceptive because they are merely imperfect manifestations of higher reality, one no longer seeks in the visible world for an explanation of the mystery and terror of being. I rose and walked toward the door. "Forgive me," he cried. "I did not mean to offend you. I have a superlative intellect, but I have a superhuman one. It's only natural that I should be aware of your limitations." "Phone if you need me," I said, and descended the stairs 2 steps at a time. "I'll send my physician over at once," I muttered to myself. "He's a hopeless maniac, and heaven knows what will happen if someone does not take charge of him immediately." Well, if you let people smoke and drink and all that stuff, and they're going to have some symptoms, and this other thing, something beyond. But people over exaggerate these things in real life. But like opiates and most drugs that people think are thinking drugs, it's not that they actually increase awareness, they just decrease certain things that are on the surface that may get in the way of focusing and realizing certain thoughts. The following is a condensation of 2 announcements which appeared in the Partridgeville Gazette for July 3rd, 1928. Earthquake shakes financial district. At 2 o'clock this morning, an earth tremor of unusual severity broke several plate glass windows in Central Square and completely disorganized the electric and street railway systems. The tremor was felt in the outlying districts, and the steeple of the First Baptist Church on Angel Hill, designed by Christopher Wren in 1717, was entirely demolished. Firemen are now attempting to put out a blaze which threatens to destroy the Partridgeville glue works. An investigation is promised by the mayor, and an immediate attempt will be made to fix responsibility for this disastrous occurrence. I personally consider it a shame that a lot of buildings that old were done away with to replace with new buildings rather than building up the other. It could have been a higher expense issue. The older buildings probably were better built out of stone and brick and better wood, but I know this book's fiction, by the way. Occult writer murdered by unknown guest. Horrible crime in Central Square. Mystery surrounds death of Halpin Commerce. At 9 a.m. today, the body of Halpin Commerce, author and journalist, was found in an empty room above the jewelry store of Smithwick and Isaacs, 24 Central Square. The coroner's investigation revealed that the room had been furnished to Mr. Commerce on May 1st, and that he had himself disposed of the furniture a fortnight ago. Commerce was the author of several recondite books on occult themes and a member of the Bibliographic Guild. He formerly resided in Brooklyn, New York. At 7 a.m., Mr. L.E. Hancock, who occupies the apartment opposite Commer's room in the Smithwick and Isaacs establishment, smelt a peculiar odor when he opened his door to take his cat, and the morning edition of the Partridgeville Gazette. The odor he describes as extremely acrid and nauseous, and he affirms that it was so strong in the vicinity of Commer's room that he was obliged to hold his nose when he approached that section of the hall. He was about to return to his own apartment when it occurred to him that Commerce might have accidentally forgotten to turn off the gas in his kitchenette. Becoming considerably alarmed at the thought, he decided to investigate. When the repeated tappings on Commer's door brought no response, he notified the superintendent. The latter opened the door by means of a pass key, and the 2 men quickly made their way into Commer's room. The room was utterly destitute of furniture, and Hancock asserts that when he first glanced at the floor, his heart went cold with him, and that the superintendent, without saying a word, walked to the open window and stared at the building opposite for fully 5 minutes. Commerce lay stretched upon his back in the center of the room. He was starkly nude, and his chest and arms were covered with a peculiar bluish pus, or ichor. His head lay grotesquely upon his chest. It had been completely severed from his body, and the features were twisted and torn and horribly mangled. Nowhere Was there a trace of blood? The room presented a most astonishing appearance. The intersections of the walls, ceiling, and floor had been thickly smeared with plaster of Paris, but at intervals fragments had cracked and fallen off, and someone had grouped these upon the floor about the murdered man so as to form a perfect triangle. Inside the body were several sheets of charred yellow paper. These bore fantastic geometric designs and symbols, and several hastily scrawled sentences. The sentences were almost illegible and so absurd in content that they furnished no possible clue to the perpetrator of the crime. I am waiting and watching, Chalmers wrote. I sit by the window and watch walls and ceiling. I do not believe they can reach me, but I must beware of the Doels. Perhaps they can help them break through. The satires will help, and they can advance through the scarlet circles. The Greeks knew a way of preventing that. It is a great pity that we have forgotten so much. On another sheet of paper, the most badly charred of the 7 or 8 fragments found by Detective Sergeant Douglas of the Partridgeville Reserve was scrawled the following. Good God, the plaster is falling. A terrific shock has loosened the plaster and is falling. An earthquake, perhaps. I never could have anticipated this. It is growing dark in the room. I must phone Frank. But can he get here in time? I will try. I will recite the Einstein formula. I will, God. They are breaking through. They are breaking through. Smoke is pouring from the corners of the wall. Their tongues, In the opinion of Detective Sergeant Douglas, Chalmers was poisoned by some obscure chemical. He sent specimens of the strange blue slime found on Chalmers' body to the Partridgeville Chemical Laboratories, and he expects the report will shed new light on one of the most mysterious crimes in recent years. That Chalmers entertained a guest on the evening preceding the earthquake is certain, for his neighbor distinctly heard a low murmur of conversation in the former's room as he passed it on his way to the stairs. Suspicion points strongly to this unknown visitor, and the police are diligently endeavoring to discover his identity. 4. Report of James Morton, chemist and bacteriologist. My dear Mr. Douglas, the fluid sent to me for analysis is the most peculiar that I have ever examined. It resembles living protoplasm, but it lacks the peculiar substances known as enzymes. Enzymes catalyst the chemical reactions occurring in living cells, and when the cell dies, they cause it to disintegrate by hydrolyzation. Without enzymes, protoplasm should possess enduring vitality, immortality. Enzymes are the negative components, so to speak, of the unicellular organism, which is the basis of all life. That living matter can exist without enzymes, biologists emphatically deny, and yet the substance that you have sent me is alive, and it lacks these indispensable bodies. Good God, sir, do you realize what astounding new vistas this opens up? Excerpt from The Secret Watcher by the late Halpin Chalmers. What if parallel to the life we know, there is another life that does not die, which lacks the elements that destroy our life? Perhaps in another dimension there is a different force from that which generates our life. Perhaps this force emits energy or something similar to energy, which passes from the unknown dimension where it is and creates a new form of cell life in our dimension. No one knows that such new cell life does exist in our dimension. But I have seen its manifestations. I have talked with them. In my room at night, I have talked with Doels, and in dreams, I have seen their maker. I have stood on the dim shore beyond time and matter and seen it. It moves through strange curves and outrageous angles. Someday, I shall travel in time and meet it face to face. Now, a lot of intoxicants can grant some amazing perceptions and experiences. I was never a recreational drug user or a ritual drug user, but in real life, there's a lot of instances where people end up dying as a result of certain choices like that.